Greetings and welcome back. It has been a very long time since I had a discussion. I think I have a very good guest today. It's Mr. Novak. And Mr. Novak is a gentleman from the Midwest of the United States who has, you could say, borne personal witness to many of the problems that currently beset the United States, specifically in the quote-unquote red states, what's happened in the working white class, as well as the African American community. And more importantly, he's a man going his own way who has had many pills to swallow. And I think before we're going to start this conversation is to really start at the beginning of his journey of how he started from, sort of blue-pilled, I guess, rose-tinted glasses view of the world to his current state, which I'll let him describe for himself. So thank you for joining me, and I'll let you just take up the podium. How did this all get started?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I think we should start around 2009. This seems to be when things really began picking up the pace in terms of what to expect from myself and what ended up creating the circumstances that kind of got us into this conversation and why it's relevant. In 2009, I entered policy debate as a college student, and it was a huge culture shock for me. It was a part of my life that I look back on fondly in terms of my intellectual experiences and my ideas being shaken and moved, and also revealing to me how much I didn't know. Turns out being 18 years old, you don't actually know everything. And if there's one thing that you can really realize with policy debate is that it's a very, very unknown subculture. And this subculture is extremely far left. And so I was exposed to things like Marxism, radical feminism, things like queer theory in terms of the information I had to research and understand and argue against. And it was in 2010 that I remember being in a debate round, and I heard the advocacy for white genocide. And I'll never forget this argument because I was taken back by how serious the crowd was, how serious these individuals who are both white were advocating the actual death of all white people. And this was one example of some of the things that I'd later figure out were pretty relevant in terms of political strategy and what we would now look at and identify as identity politics. There's something about debate that really gives you a unique perspective on how the world is. Being open to different ways of thinking and arguing is been a really great opportunity for me to pursue actual engagement in the world, and we'll get into that later. But how it's been kind of in vain. It seems like it doesn't matter how much you learn, how much you know, how well you can argue something. As Ben Shapiro would say, facts don't care about your feelings, but as I'd like to discuss later on, feelings don't really care about your facts. and it's hard to change people's minds. And so I'm rambling a little bit here, but my debate experience from 2009 to 2011 was really how this journey began. Where I learned that some of the things that were being that were kind of simmering to the top in terms of radical left ideology, what we'd look at as identity politics, as regressive left agenda, were in the making. And it was only around 2015 I realized that this was going to be an issue. So that's how this process really began. When it comes to my journey, and it's something that I've been able to use to my advantage, and I've also been the victim of it as well.
And when you say it was the beginning of your journey, it was the beginning of your journey and being exposed to, I guess, things that were regarded prior to that as just, well, you'd never heard of it, essentially. You just never encountered it. The debates, right? Yeah.
Right. I mean, policy debate sounds pretty straightforward, and to an extent, it really is. It's you're given a resolution each year, and you're supposed to discuss the policy of these things. But as as I realized in my tenure in policy debate, there's a huge shift from straightforward pragmatism and political discussion to more philosophical and critical and less policy, more racially identified argumentation. And it really reared its ugly head, and it started getting out of control, in my opinion, when I was hearing arguments like white genocide, which had no reason to be in policy debate. This has gotten so bad now that there are minority teams in the actual activity itself that are just advocating for open violence, and there's just nothing but capitulation from the left, and the entire atmosphere has become inverted because of these type of arguments, because of this type of philosophy, and it perfectly reflects how the broader society is dealing with the wokeness of today's common culture and censorship, specifically with race. And so this was definitely the first step into the pool of nonsense that we see happening today.
And from there, I mean, as far as I know, you used to be a very pious Christian, or at least a believing Christian. And that somehow,
Yeah, that's
right, that was the next step in your journey of many pills, so to speak.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things I was exposed to, I was raised Catholic. I came out of high school into college as this staunch, red-blooded Midwestern conservative who, had been raised that this is the way things are, and don't go into college. They're going to try to indoctrinate you and liberalize you. And to an extent, my parents were right when they warned me about this. But one of the things, and as you said, one of the first things that really started my journey down this path was being tested on my religious faith, specifically Catholicism. And it was being introduced to actual atheists. I had never met any until that point. This is how big of a right-wing bubble that I was exposed to. And so this was extremely uncomfortable. I started doing a lot of mental gymnastics and arguing with these people, and I knew how to do it because I was a debater. So I can make up all kinds of reasons why God exists and they're wrong. And as time went on, I began to really understand that maybe there's something to this. Maybe I need to take another look at this. And I slowly came to the acceptance that perhaps there's not a higher power. Perhaps Catholicism isn't what I was told it was. Perhaps God doesn't exist. And I could say without any dispute that this was the first real big red pill, if you will, I had to swallow. The God pill, I guess. Can we call it that?
It's interesting. I was mentioning prior that I noticed I've met a lot of people, spoke to them, some people I knew better than others, including I hate to bring this up. This is Adam Jensen, who I had on a few times on my channel. He killed himself on this day, 2017.
Wow.
That was his first pill, too, is breaking away from religion, although he had been raised in a Protestant family and had been a bit earlier. And this is something I find fascinating, essentially as an outsider, someone who grew up just irreligiously. There was no reference to any sort of religion in my household ever. My father had a reference for cathedrals and churches. He liked, the structure, but it was pretty to look at. But none of that ever existed. So it's hard for me personally to relate. I'd like to try to, but it's hard to really go through that struggle and just how much it can really set other things off. Because I noticed, other people that I've known or talked to, factfully, to make common reference there, I know he started off religiously, and since then he's had this, I could say, thirst to understand religious motivation. All these things that sort of get triggered by this initial impulse of throwing off religion, whereas for me, it never... I guess I've always been an atheist. Initially, I don't think when I was very young I thought terribly much about it, but it just seemed that religious propositions were almost self-evidently absurd just by the very nature of some of these miraculous claims and what have
Right.
you. And then, but I've met subsequently, I'd say primarily the last 10 to 15 years, just tons of people who've had a different experience, and sometimes really traumatic ones. In one case, I recall the person in question was effectively excommunicated from the family, and to this day doesn't have
Yep.
contact. And the late Adam Jensen, he would still go home Christmas and pretend. He would go through the rituals, he'd attend church, pretend he believed it was this, dark secret that he had to sort of
Yep.
keep within himself, away from even, he had 4 or 5 siblings, and keep away from everybody. Nobody could know. And so I can imagine what impact this had, and how something like that, religious belief, then when you let go of it, can start this landslide where you're just essentially swallowing one pill after another.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And my condolences to your friend, but he definitely shares a very similar experience to a lot of people who were not born in more of a secular household, such as yourself.
Yeah.
And when you realize, as I did around 2014, is when I don't know how the process happens for a lot of people, but for me, it was a gradual skepticism in my faith that really led me to a exact point where I flipped the switch. Essentially, I realized that this isn't real, this isn't true, and at that moment, I fell into a extremely nihilistic type of experience and existential dread, because basically my entire spiritual and moral foundation had been stripped away all at once, and it was a really, really difficult thing to deal with. And to your point, and in relationship to your friend, I spent about 4 years openly pretending that I still believed in front of my family, in front of my friends. And it was a extremely uncomfortable experience to go through, especially when it's the people you care about. But that's one of the justifications you try to rationalize, is you don't want to hurt them or offend them or really step into that territory, given how uncomfortable religious faith is.
May I ask a question on the point? It's hard for me not, because this is the day of his death. When Adam Jensen talked about his religious upbringing, I think he was very cognizant of a feeling that he had, that it had damaged him psychologically. And I would say, in my own analysis of his situation in his life, that was the case. Did you feel, in addition trying to avoid, you could say, hurtful interactions, did you feel that whether it was intentional or not, that your religious upbringing had damaged you in some regard, or was that just not a feeling you had at all?
In retrospect, I see how it held me back in terms of really trying to seek the truth and have a better understanding of how other people live their lives. A lot of the questions I would ask, I was actually raised and brought up in a Catholic school as well. I only left that education starting in high school. But yeah, I would definitely say that there was some harm done in it, in terms of the narrow thinking, the inability to really question what's happening, to go with the flow. When all that is taken away, you realize how much time you've lost in terms of being able to explore the world as it really is, and not have this blindfold put in over you. And so there's a frustration in that. I sympathize with the idea that it's better on a social level to kind of, even if I can't imagine how many closeted Christians there are that actually are atheists, that continue to, go through the motions and try not to be disruptive. And I sympathize with that, because I finally reached the point where I didn't want to do that anymore. It was, like I said, around 2014 when I finally told my parents that I didn't believe in God. And the reaction was as bad as I thought it would be. My mother starts crying. My father just shakes his head. Huge disconnect that really never has been reconnected. I've never really been able to reconnect with him on, and it's left a void in my relationship with my family. I've lost friends because of it. So it's not like, yeah.
Are you the only one in your family that is a disbeliever, by the way? Your siblings believe as well, or continue to?
As far as I know, yes.
Okay.
Um, no one else has. I think they saw, if they don't believe, they saw what happened to me and they're like, it's not worth it, which
Right.
is, it's really frustrating. But I've never had another family member come up to me and, behind closed doors say, I think I understand what you mean and all that. Everyone's pretty pious. My father's really gone off the deep end with his faith. I mean, he makes the Pope look like Christopher Hitchens these days. So, and we'll bring up a specific issue later on that I'd like to talk about in regards to that, in regards to red pilling and trying to actually test people's ideas and beliefs, even in a non-religious context. But one thing I wanted to bring up was, as someone who was never really, well, not at all, brought up in a religious type of atmosphere, and I understand looking at it from the outside, there was a huge level of absurdity. But I imagine that you had to interact with a lot of Christians. Like, was that ever a discussion? As the question to you, was that ever a discussion that you ever felt comfortable talking to? Because it was really taboo to discuss religion as a religious person.
Well,
Did you ever feel any, reluctance to try to dive into those
never
type of
directly,
ideas?
but I should point out that the kind of, because it seems adjacent in a way, anti-theism, the kind of anti-theism that a lot of people felt very enamored of, especially in the mid-2000s during the so-called New Atheist movement.
New atheism,
Right.
yeah.
I never felt that, because I think a lot of that is born of a kind of a resentment. We talked about it just now, of having been brought up in a certain way, and people having felt they lost time or they've been harmed. It was never taboo for me to talk about it, and so I would talk about it. But I also I was never one of these preach to the world atheists. I don't wear my atheism in my sleeve. I mean, to a degree, I do. I mean, someone says, "What do you believe?" I just say I'm an atheist. Fine, but I'm not particularly passionate about it because it's something I've thought about a little bit, but it just never was
Right.
that consequential. So, was there no taboo explicitly? I don't go out of my way. And this I think transfers on occasion. I've had the distributus Dave on, and the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
distributus is very Catholic, extremely Catholic, and I know
Oh,
that there
yes.
would be probably zero consensus on our sort of metaphysical view of God and the world, and I don't see it as being very productive. I mean, I don't know how I come across, but I'm not necessarily trying to convince people of my view per se, and especially with something I'm not sure how consequential it is to convince people or I guess disabuse people of their religious belief. It's just never it's never interested me, but I've never had any qualms about talking about it if it's brought up. I'm just I sort of casually will say, well, yeah, I'm an atheist. Here are the reasons. And if you,
Right, right.
but what I have encountered, and this doesn't just go for religion, is that if I don't acknowledge the alleged veracity of other people's beliefs, it could be, it doesn't have to be religious, it could be political or ideological. People have gotten very annoyed with me. I said, well, okay, if that's your view, that's fine. I don't think we're going to reach a consensus. Why don't we move on to something where we maybe could have a more productive or interesting discussion? And I've encountered that with the religious people where they were the ones that just couldn't let it go, where they just insisted on effectively preaching to me. I told them I'm just not interested. I've heard all the arguments before. I've done my own investigation of the so-called holy books, and I'm sorry, I'm not convinced, but I don't want to prevent you from believing. But that's the problem with the religious, or any really ideological belief. But religious belief, I think, is very sort of like a case study in this, is that the more people you have on, say, team religion or team belief, the better you feel about yourself, because belief is consolidated and indeed strengthened by numbers. It's
Yes.
it's kind of like a mass argumentum ad populum, where hey, look at all these people that they believe as I do, and that soothes the ego, and everyone can kind of essentially jerk each other off in their ideological echo chamber. It's very pronounced. It's
Yeah.
very pronounced in religion, and so that is the one experience I've had that I find very irksome, where I'm not allowed to just go my own way and do my own thing. I'm not running around telling people, hey, don't believe in God. Here are the reasons. But people get really annoyed, religious people, when I tell them I don't. And of course, there are certain things in terms of worldview that would conflict, as far as where ethics are derived from and things like that. I take a more naturalistic view, obviously, but that seems to be the biggest hook I've encountered, where I don't have any issue talking about it. But when I just say, okay, you believe that, I'm not here to convince you, they still need to either convince me or they need to at least attempt to drive me insane. I know where it comes from. People like having other people think and believe the things they do. But it's just not for me. I get a bit of a long-winded answer. I'm not really good at being pithy, but there you go.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think it actually goes a little further because there might be a more comfortable relationship between those who believe and those who don't outside of the United States. But given the level of Christian fundamentalism, the deep history of religion as part of the American way of living, there's a unique stigmatization of atheism in particular that creates a really, really, really vapid reaction from people who believe. It seems like as a Christian, you can somewhat understand different people's religions and faiths, and you have this understanding, like, okay, I don't think you're correct. I think your beliefs, your gods are false idols, false gods, but at least you believe in it. Where atheism specifically is the antithetical religious experience, if you will. It's the complete opposite of what people believe in on a very, very deep level. And Sam Harris talks about this all the time, that the label of atheism itself has really, really been co-opted into something it's not. And I can anecdotally definitely understand what he's talking about. I've openly discussed religion and finally just openly said to many people that I'm an atheist, and the look I get from them of disgust and disbelief, and it just turns their perception of me on its head. And I've been accused of everything, of cannibalism to devil worship, and
Really?
I laugh at, oh yeah, the whatever they're being fed in terms of what they've been told atheism actually is, has got to be part of the propaganda and not engaging with the ideas of atheism. It's
But
some sort of spiritual defense mechanism that's supposed to put you away from that idea. So when you hear the word atheism, especially in the experiences I've had with people, there's a huge reluctance to go any further in the discussion. And finally, they'll let it slip, like, well, why do you do those things that you do? And I kind of give them a look like, well, what do you mean? And it'll be things from like demonic worship, and this is what they've been told. This is what they've been told is. And I laugh now because I have to clarify those things. But this is not an uncommon thing in America.
I think it's much more common in a couple of points. I mean, you brought Sam Harris up, and it's interesting because one of his earliest points back in the day, and now he's been around for quite some time, was that every say believing Christian knows what it's like to be an atheist about the gods of Greece or what have you. This is not. I mean, right. As somebody who grew up functionally as an atheist, I just don't. Not having a belief is not really descriptive. It's sort of not having a belief is not descriptive really of anything. I don't.
Right.
It doesn't inspire me in any way. It's just. It's an absence of something, but the absence of something doesn't mean it's the polar opposite. I think what you're describing seems to be not necessarily the absence of something, but really the opposite end. So where you have sort of the hallowed state of Christianity, I guess atheism in this case is some sort of demonic endeavor. Now I should point out, as I grew up in a very large northeastern city, that kind of profound religious belief is it's hard to come by. I mean, most people, even if they're religious, you don't, because you have to understand, I think there's a sociological function for religion in the United States. The United States is it's a vast place, And in places where you come from, the Midwest and the South, and really just, I hate to use this term because it has it's taken on a negative connotation, but sort of flyover states, right? Where the
Oh,
conglomerations of people there are so scattered that religion, whatever the metaphysics, underlying metaphysics might be, then it serves as social glue and social capital. And so people come together in cooperative ways, and it gives them a sense of community. I think that probably more
absolutely.
than, yeah, maybe, sure, people probably believe the metaphysics and the claims, but I think the social function is much more powerful. Now, I'm not going to praise the urban environment of big American cities. It's hardly a nice place, but you're already sort of sandwiched together, and you don't have that spread out landscape where you need to sort of, I guess, come together. Otherwise, you're all alone. You're never really alone.
Right.
That's not necessarily a good thing either. But so I think a lot of the sociology behind religion, places in the Midwest where you're from, in the South, it just comes down to areas that are just very spread out, where the social glue is best found in religion because it's a useful tradition, and it makes people feel that they have a sense of community, and it makes people feel that they belong somewhere. The converse of that is growing up in a large city like I did, where you don't have a feeling of belonging whatsoever. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but trying to engender a feeling of belonging in a concrete jungle where you have, probably 10,000 different denominations of different religions, another
Hmm.
10,000 different ethnicities, another 10,000, you hear different languages every day. I don't know what you're supposed to find there that's going to be the common glue. So I'm not. That's hardly a good thing, and it has a lot of negatives. But it's certainly for me, if I were to, as an outsider, to look at a phenomenon in the Midwest or the South, or really just anywhere between, say, California and New York, or the Northeast, that
Hmm.
is just a common thread, and it makes perfect sense. It doesn't mean I believe in the things they believe, but it makes sense that people would hold to those beliefs because it's just really useful. And you've seen it yourself when when you when you become an apostate, when you
Right.
engage in an apostasy, that glue that used to bind you to friends and family, it weakens and it becomes severed, and you're not really left with much after that, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think this kind of can bring us into this next chapter that I've kind of gone through. In terms of the social cohesion that religiosity has, it's undeniable. It plays a huge part in social capital and cohesion in community. And in the United States, as technology, modernity, and political and, well, on many levels, there's been a large social stratification. One of the last bastions of connectedness that we have with each other has been religion, for better or for worse. And so, if this will come into play later on in our discussion, but bringing it back to the atheism itself, I realized that this was the beginning of my journey as I started looking and walking through this. And like I said, this my acceptance of the idea that God does not exist really solidified in around 2014. And as time went on, I started becoming more and more interested in these four horsemen of the apocalypse:
Right.
Dennett, Dawkins, Harris, and Hitchens. And I learned quite a bit. I heard all the major arguments and their perspectives, and I was really interested in hearing a intellectual side to atheism that I had never ever been exposed to. So this was reigniting my intellectual curiosity that I hadn't had since my days in debate. I mean, for everything that my career and my formal college experience has allowed me, there was nothing like the esoteric uniqueness that debate provided, and atheism finally reignited this red pill journey. The second part of this really started coming when I learned about this MGTOW. I don't know if you've ever heard of that term before, but
Yeah.
yeah,
I thought I might
yeah,
have heard about it someplace. So.
once or twice. Yeah, it's interesting. I remember seeing a meme that said OP MGTOW, and it showed some guy and this girl, and you could tell that he's really trying to shut her down, but I'd never seen that term before, and so I looked it up, and wow, turns out there's this school of thinking that really exposes the underbelly of how relationships operate, and the interpersonal relationships between men and women, and how that's really affected in today's society. And turns out a lot of men are having similar experiences. And so in terms of YouTube, I think the very first channel I actually became exposed to was MGTOW 101. It was more of a comical, more of a lighthearted and shitposting type of channel. But as time went on, I also ran into channels like Sandman, and then eventually I think I saw it in a comment one time, is a recommendation to go to this Thinking-Ape character, which I would recommend. And he gave a really interesting perspective, a more philosophical explanation, and also a perspective and angle on how MGTOW really is, how it operates, what your expectations are, that really no other channel I had found had done before. And so I thought this guy was pretty good. I'd recommend him if you haven't seen him. But he MGTOW itself became a way of thinking that I really embraced, and in doing so, as you said earlier, it's not a panacea, right? It's a perspective that is showing you an alternative to your life, but the end game is up to you. And there's going to be a thread in my thinking as we continue, in the sense that, for me, I've been exposed to certain truths about the world that are extremely uncomfortable, that are and sometimes damaging or psychologically impactful in my own life. But the bright side and the positive side of those things is that I've been stripped of all the cognitive barriers that really put most people off in experiencing the truth. Does that make sense?
It does. And I wanted to ask you something, because I don't think I've ever asked you what specifically about "quote unquote" going your own way appealed to you. Was it, for me, there were a number of things, but it just seemed like this repetitious failure, going through the same motion every time, engaging in these relationships. And I was curious, what was why did it resonate with you, being exposed to Manosphere or MGTOW material? What made it click for you, basically?
Sure. The frequency of similar experiences really blew me away when it came to seeing how other guys were coming into the Manosphere and why they were embracing this way of thinking. I think I've mentioned this to you before. From the best that I can see, there's two groups of men in this MGTOW type of thinking, and in this area, and it's older guys who have gone through the ringer of marriage and survived to come out on the other side, who've certainly been damaged by the family courts and things like that. And then there's younger guys, and I think I'm more in this group because I've never been married, who are having a consistent pattern of relationships that really seem to fail or fall short in a very similar way. And as someone who had very serious relationships, who had been in love, and was getting to an age where I was one of the social expectation that I needed to start finding someone to settle down with became more and more expected. I began to take a closer look at what am I supposed to be. What is the expected outcome if I do this? And it's been MGTOW that really allowed me to see that you can do something else. You don't have to go this way. You don't have to get married. Yes, it's a social norm. Yes, there are potential positive outcomes in living that way. But I think the most honest version of MGTOW isn't just to show the hypocrisy of women, the bias of the courts, but it's to show that
the option exists.
a honest, an honest alternative with honest expectations of what that alternative path can be.
Did that
And it's
create
very open.
conflict between, in the same way that the religious division did, where you ended up explaining to family and friends that you wish them well, but this whole thing is not for you? Was that a source of conflict as well?
Not nearly. In fact,
Hmm.
when I finally started, I mean, there had been an expectation, and I had stopped dating for several years, and so there's questions like, when are you going to get back out there, and have you seen anybody lately? Which is the question I get asked every family event. Seeing anyone these days? And I finally just kind of let them have it in terms of my perspective on modern relationships, dating, and marriage. And I was speaking to my parents and my siblings about this, and I just went through all of it. I went through the divorces. I mean, there's half of my family's been divorced multiple times. My stepfather, who raised me, had been married 3 times, so he was really quiet when I started talking about all. Yeah,
Yeah.
but it was my mother who was trying to, who had this expectation. I think I wasn't sure if it was this, she's getting old and she wants grandkids, or she was concerned that I needed to find someone to make me happy. But as I started talking about how relationships work, how the dynamics between men and women really are in terms of things like hypergamy and expectations of men on a very primal level, and the likely outcome for a lot of men in today's society, they kind of just looked at each other and eventually just kind of nodded their head like, okay, well, yeah, that makes sense, Nick. I can't argue with that. And so they've let me off the hook in the sense that they know they can't really argue with. That's probably the other thing about MGTOW that I enjoyed was you're not, the manosphere isn't trying to blow smoke up your ass. These things are true. These things are correct in their evaluation, whether it's the science behind hypergamy,
Largely, there is distortion.
Right.
I mean,
Sure.
and this is something that I think a lot of people have been taking note of, particularly a few evolutionary psychologists, that there's a kind of orthodoxy that's presented in the manosphere where you get many kernels of truth, maybe an overarching truth, but the details don't matter. And I think I have to be honest that I've seen I guess an ideological transformation in the last couple of years. The manosphere, where there's certain narratives need to be pitched regardless, and the details matter less. But yeah, that's true of everything. And
yeah.
I agree with you that, sure, blowing smoke up people's ass certainly was never my intention, and
Right.
you pay a price for that. I think people aren't.
Yes.
I mean, there's this notion, and I actually think it's a Christian notion. The truth will set you free. I don't think that's actually the case. I mean, truth, as we could divine from the Peterson-Harris debate, is it's hard to agree on what that is. But being exposed to a set of facts or some information that seems to correlate with how you understand reality, let's put it that way, it doesn't always set you free, and sometimes quite the opposite. It can cripple you to the point of inaction. And again, I'll bring it up because it's his second year anniversary of his death. That in the case of Adam Jensen, I think he in a way, it almost just swallowed too many truth pills, that it just got to the point where it was so overwhelming. And I've seen this in other cases, guys just not knowing whither or whence and what they're supposed to be doing. And so, yeah, that's something that it's a serious issue. I still feel myself obligated in a way towards men to explain certain things. I don't, in a way I wouldn't otherwise be on most issues. But for men who sort of blithely enter into relationships or marriage and just don't think it's a big deal, they don't understand the parameters, and I feel obligated to present certain information. But I also know that it's risky, I don't think every man can walk away from the sort of manosphere style red pilling unscathed and necessarily come out the better for it, based on my experience and observations, because it can take something away. That's not true of everybody, but we have to acknowledge that people receive things differently, and the red pill can easily turn into the quote unquote black pill, and there isn't always a solution for that because it really comes down to the individual.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I feel like you just kind of described my whole experience with it perfectly, in the sense that there is, and you've talked about it many times in the past, this malaise that you get from going your own way, because you're essentially rejecting very, very deep rooted biological, sociological, and maybe even evolutionarily entrenched roles that a man's supposed to have, and that is child, being a father, being a husband or a partner. Walking away from that's not easy. Walking away from that has a huge impact that is likely to stay with you to some degree for as long as you decide to go your own way. It's what you decide to do when you go down that path as a alternative that seems to be where a lot of men start to divide, and that's whether or not they have been able to adequately adjust to this type of life expectation or life journey, and being able to deal with the long-term effects of not taking the more normal route of marriage and child rearing and all that. So you're absolutely right about that.
Oh, it's worse than that. I mean, I've encountered men who, I could say, they've been with me for a long time, as in they've been subscribed, and I've had communications with them, who just, they tell me flat out, look, Stardust, I know all this stuff, but fuck it, I'm going to try it anyway. Basically trying to go down the conventional route, because whatever. I mean, it's a paraphrase, but it's basically something along the lines of, I'm tired of just sitting around playing video games, and certainly that makes sense, because again, it's up to you to find something that you find somewhat meaningful and fulfilling in, I don't want to necessarily call it a void, but in the absence of. I made a video about this eons ago that probably preceded the existence of Thinking-Ape, because I used to have an older channel, because I've been around for actually longer than, and you came on a bit later, and there was a kind of, I believe the title was something like, Man's Love of Unfreedom. There's the thought behind it being that as bad as it is, being stuck in some shitty relationship or marriage or some kind of fixed routine.
We like the servitude.
Yeah, the routine, the structure is better than the wild, the steps where you're just, what am I supposed to do? All of a sudden you have all this time, and you have, what are you actually supposed to do with your life? So it's just a lot easier. And I don't blame people for that, men for that. Just, okay, it's not that great. But, from this part of the day to that part of the day, I'm at work, and then I come home, and then my wife orders me to take out the trash, and then I got to read bedtime story to my kids, and then on the mall, on the weekend, we go to the mall again. I mean, routine is hugely important for just about everybody, but that kind of structured routine, and it's strange that it often comes down to just that, because for a lot of guys, I mean, this is something we don't talk about frequently, but in order to engage in, you could say, creative activity, you need to have a certain mind for it. Part of that's intelligence, but it's not the only factor. It's a quality of personality, and a lot of men out there who it just seems to me that outside of their familial duties, there's not a whole lot going on there, nor the desire for it. And if you strip something, if you take that away from a man who would otherwise be unoccupied and just not really doing anything, that could be devastating. On the other hand, you get guys like Hugh Mann, the Australian, you might know him.
Yeah, he's great.
He just always wants to do stuff, and he's he's an artist of sorts and he's always playing with things. But I'd say that's not the norm. I'd say that he's probably more, not a rarity, but more uncommon than the norm. I think a lot of guys I've encountered over the years really feel that emptiness, and routine, as bad as a routine might be,
It's comfortable.
It's comfortable, and it gives you something to do. And sure, you can bitch and complain, but it's just something familiar. Whereas the alternative, and it's something I have to deal with on a daily, is trying to think about all the things you should be doing, the things that you should be doing since you've essentially decided to free yourself from the conventional constraints, or the things that you should be doing are the things that you personally think are important. So right now there's a book sitting on my couch that I've been meaning to read about ancestral genetics. I ordered recently and I haven't gotten around to it, and I should be starting that this weekend. There's no dictate from on high or below, in the case of your wife, who's typically shorter than you are, that you're supposed to be doing certain things. You have to essentially forge yourself anew every day. And I'm not going to lie, I struggle with that sometimes. Sometimes I succeed, and sometimes I fail utterly. It tends to be hit or miss. I'm not going to lie about that. But that's the challenge, and it's a challenge that isn't well explored because obviously no one in the mainstream would advocate for that. The mainstream advocates precisely for that more comfortable, conventional road most taken, as opposed to the road less taken or not taken.
Less taken. Right.
It for me, and I'm working on a video on this very topic. It certainly wasn't a choice. I have too many pangs for personal freedom, and I'm willing to take on the burden of having to challenge myself with things that I think are important, because it comes down to what I think is important rather than to what other people think is important. It's not easy. It's not easy, It's definitely not easy.
No.
I'd be the last person to say that it's easy. If a guy thinks it's easy, then he's probably got a natural gift where every day he's just bursting with creative energy, and and then I add various health problems to that, and it becomes even more of a task. So I don't think it's not easy, and I understand the temptation, and I understand where you're coming from. Because we'll get to that in a bit, I guess, where you have this multi-layered red pilling, for lack of a better way of describing it, where it's like I guess you feel a bit like Atlas, and no one's even acknowledging that the globe is on your shoulders to begin with, and the problem, I think the fundamental problem is it's not as if you... See, there's a distinction between, through your behavior, going back to some conventional setup. So let's say you've taken the red pill, or you're a guy, and it's just not working for you, and say, okay, I'll just find a wife, whatever, and you decide to do that. It's not like people, they can just erase their beliefs and think, oh, this is, women are all sugar and spice and all things nice, and she just wants to love... No one's going to believe that. So
you can't go back either once you take the red pill.
That's right. It's really cheesy and it's really hackneyed, but the truth is that line from Morpheus is, once you...
It's dead on.
You're not going to return back to that previous state of ignorance. That's difficult, but when you've taken multiple pills, when your biggest issue, I think, I don't want to make that claim. I don't know you but well enough. But
go ahead.
But my interpretation of your biggest issue is people's lack of receptivity to discussion, lack of open-mindedness, and as you pointed out in the beginning, that you're absolutely right about this. Unfortunately, that feelings don't care about facts. I mean, talk about briefly. You were involved in debate. There's a distinction between discussion and debate. A debate, traditionally at least, takes place, or conventionally perhaps, in an effort to win an audience over. So whilst in a debate you might be talking about truthful points or making truthful points and trying to add information that reflects data or whatever, it's largely irrelevant, because the audience is looking for emotional cues that they can latch onto that will convince them. That's not the same thing as a discussion. Now, the problem is that people in general, as you pointed out, people are much more motivated by feeling. This is a universal. Women more so than men, but men too. And I think that's another aspect of the red pill. Part of this malaise is that when you choose not to blow smoke up people's ass, and when you choose to be truthful, you're essentially removing an entire layer of emotion from the platform, from the discussion, because there's so much emotion tied up in romantic entanglements with women, as there is obviously with religion, and just about every other thing that's near and dear to the hearts of human apes.
Right.
And people are not receptive to that, because you could bring up dozens of charts, all citing the data. You'd be lucky if they even have a look at it, and they just don't care. They go back to because it feels good. I'm trying. The analogy isn't perfect, but there's a scene in the film Seven that was filmed in the 1990s. Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman star in it. I don't know if you've ever seen it. I'd recommend it.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're
It's
in a
good.
bar, and Freeman is saying, his character Detective Summers says that it's hard. It's easier to lose yourself in drugs than it is to cope with life. It's easier to beat a child than it is to raise it. All these things, these sort of obvious truisms. It's easier to ride off the elation of your own feelings and emotions than it is to accept things so in a sober manner that it doesn't really do very much for you. So, okay, that seems to be true. What do I do with that? It's very frustrating because if you know that's yeah, go on.
It's measurably damaging too. I agree completely with you. You brought up a lot of points there. I want to first go back to the beginning in your discussion of the manosphere about how some men go ahead and take the plunge. They found their unicorn, and they're going to go ahead and live the married life. I don't actually have much. I know a lot of guys get really frustrated who are in our camp, so to speak, when they see guys do this. But to the ones that are thinking about it, the best I can say is, the information that MGTOW's shown you, tread carefully. But like you said, and I agree completely, this is just the way it is on multiple levels. Once you take that red pill, you don't get to unlearn whatever this red pilling has shown you. You don't get to reject it. I guess you could try. You can live your life with this huge amount of cognitive dissonance as you try to navigate the world. But to the men going back, I wish them the very best. They know the risk. They know how the game is played. I couldn't do it because I would always have the MGTOW lens on, right? Even when we're taking our vows, like, I know she just wants my money and resources. So in that regard, I wish them the best, and I just hope that they have an informed understanding of what's at stake and what the potential consequences are. This goes into your last point about the truth and the uncomfortable. When I was in debate, you're right. There's a winner and there's a loser, and I learned a lot of the technical aspects of argumentation on how to win. And winning is not the same as trying to seek the truth. And this is something that the IDW, and I'd like to move into the political aspect of this.
Yeah,
in just
I'll just make a brief quote or offer a quote that came to mind, or I don't remember the entirety. A.E. Housem, an English author, it's a famous and snarky quote, but it's very true. And I'm quoting: "The average man, if he meddles with criticism at all, is a conservative critic. His opinions are determined not by his reason. The bulk of mankind," says Swift, "is as well qualified for flying as for thinking, but by his passions, and the faintest of all human passions is the love of truth. He believes that the texts of ancient authors is generally sound, not because he has acquainted himself with the elements of the problem, but because he would feel uncomfortable if he did not believe it, just as he believes on the same cogent evidence that he is a fine fellow and that he will rise again from the dead." So the key point being, of course, that the passion for truth is the faintest of passions. So
that was beautifully said. Who wrote that?
A.E. Housman. He's an English author. Yeah.
Yeah, that was great, and it's the truth. I think we're all raised, especially in the West, to understand that honesty is important. Don't lie to people. At least, that's definitely been the one of the underlying Christian ethics that I was raised with. I don't think that's exclusive by any means, because no one wants to be lied to or deceived in general. But if you really embrace that to its fullest extent, you realize why people don't do it. Louis C.K. actually has a really great, the comedian has a really great bit where he talks about how his daughter learned to lie for the first time, and he makes the remark, he's like, yeah, it's my daughter learned to lie, and it's kind of hard to pull that one back. It's kind of hard to tell someone that the quickest and easiest answer to all your life's troubles is something you shouldn't do. And the point he was making is that lying and speaking in half truths and not really confronting uncomfortable aspects of your life in an honest way is a much easier path to go down than, I guess, in a Jungian sense. Jordan Peterson talks about facing your shadow or confronting uncomfortable truths, and the IDW seems to be an embodiment of that on an academic level. And
Partially,
I
yes.
think partially, yes. There's, despite them being very heterodox in many ways, there are certain no-go zones that they refuse to actually step into. That I think we would both agree, and maybe that's a whole other discussion, that whether they are going to talk about it or not, it's extremely relevant. But
No.
I want to move on to the political aspect of my journey and why it's relevant now. And I think a lot of people listening are going to really see just how the culture war, if you like, or the political dynamics and the way things are churning out in many different ways isn't just from YouTube videos, reaction videos. It's not. I've had a real in-depth experience with this on a face-to-face level with people, and I really think that and to go back to a question you had earlier, a lot of my ability to actually do these type of things and engage on this political level is, one, because I have my debate background was great in trying to argue, but things like my acceptance of atheism, or acceptance of God doesn't exist, accepting MGTOW, being stripped of preconceived notions that were meant to help guide me falsely, I would say, definitely allowed me to engage in uncomfortable situations that, as you said, almost no one really wants to have. They might pay lip service to it, but as I realized, especially more recently than not, people, how do I frame this? People, when you're debating with someone, you have the idea that you can change their mind, that reason, logic, and rational thinking is the way forward. But most people, even if completely eviscerated on their position, when confronted with undeniable evidence that they are undisputably, beyond a shadow of doubt, incorrect about their assumptions, still don't change their mind, or at least the majority don't.
They double down.
It's not even, perhaps I should, take pause. Maybe I'm wrong about this, and I've really tried to tap into that recently with a lot of people. When I get them to that point, like, look, I'm not trying to own you, or what are the kids saying these days? BTFO.
Yes.
No, on a point, I'm trying to get you to look at maybe you're wrong about this, and do you really want to lie to yourself? Do you really want to live with a opinion about something that's just undeniably true? And I guess the answer is yes. They never straightforward say it that way, but to my political experience, I'd like to dive into that now.
Sure.
So my next red pill started probably around 2015. And this has definitely had a very, very serious impact on me, and I guess it's something that we can connect on. The realization that there's an interlinking narrative that's been formed over the last several decades. There's been a macro level planning, formulation of how we got to this point in politics in the world today.
Mm.
And the thing I think we connect on is that in the last 10 years, I've lost 5 friends to suicide. As your friend Adam Jensen had experienced himself. And as a man in the Midwest, I want to start off by saying that 3 of these were from opioids,
Yeah.
and 2 of them, they took their life with a gun, and it was after a divorce. And so I think looking back now, it seems that that might have been a reason why I stepped into MGTOW. Or I imagine there was a subconscious push towards that, because I understood, despite the fact that I wish they never did it, that it turns out, divorce and relationships have a huge psychological impact on men more than women, which turns out to be
massive.
true.
I mean, women. This is not, unfortunately, not well studied, or as well studied as it should be. But women recover much more rapidly. Conventional explanations usually revolve around women have more support networks, which they traditionally do. Men tend to try to solve problems in a way that they internalize to try to solve problems in a kind of sequential way. Let's say we have a problem, 1, 2, 3. If you do ABC, that you get. This is not, when you're going through a divorce, the problem persists as long as it persists. It's not a problem you fix, and men like to fix things. It's my own interpretation. Yep. Because, like I said, this is not very well studied. I should also point out, this is somewhat tangential, but so much of the things that I wish there were better studies on throughout my time on YouTube talking about male-female issues, it's just not out there. And so you're just left to either speculate or draw upon the information available. So yes, women have better support networks typically. They're not looking to fix problems. They'd rather just talk it through, and that is cathartic for many of them. And men don't operate along those lines. And then you add to that other layer that, generally speaking, most of the sympathy that will be offered to the female and not the male, obviously.
Right.
So you end up in a situation. I mean, he didn't get married, but my friend Adam Jensen had a long-term ex that was just absolutely insidious and haunted him to his dying day. I'm certain of this. In fact, last communication I had with him was a little less a week before he shot himself, and he would still report this female traumatized him. So yeah, it's a huge issue, and there aren't good studies on this because nobody really gives a shit about men, and they don't really see it. Maybe that'll change in time, but yeah. So it's a big issue, and one that is criminally understudied, and we're just left to use the best that we can, or do the best we can to think about these problems and try to figure out why it comes into being. And I don't know if that's a problem, but what's the solution to that specifically? I mean, that's a red pill in itself. The whole process of how a man becomes things like female validation, the attachment men feel. For most men, I mean, having that taken away via divorce or even a really bad breakup, it takes away from their sense of self. Women do get validation through men too, but they also have social networks and connections, and men are typically loners. And to the extent that they do have friends, male friends also tend to be more thing-focused. They're not going to be a good antidote to that kind of thing. It's a very complex issue that's just not very well researched, to be honest. I mean, the stats are out there, and off the top of my head, I don't recall exactly, but
yeah, I'd like to disagree with you on that.
Okay,
Stardust. I think it has been well researched that men definitely internalize, take a more stoic approach.
I agree with that. Yeah,
support networks, and we know that the evidence is very clear that losing that provider role, if you will, as a spouse or as a father, and in being in having it done so in such a way that it's just a life. I mean, the way the family court systems are set up, it's not only are you stripped of these foundational ways of living as a man. There's the icing on the cake of alimony, of child support, of you don't really get an option in this. And there have been a lot of people, women like, and they're few and far between, but women like Karen Strauss.
Strawn.
Excuse me,
Strawn.
sorry.
Yeah.
Is a perfect advocate for it, and trying to show like the male disposability, the lack of compassion or consideration of men's issues in general. And I think the evidence is very clear. The advocacies are out there. But for some reason, and I guess it's the gynocentric nature the way we live in society now, that has just not made it a priority, despite the growing trends of negative outcomes that it's creating. And whether it's the issues of divorce or the single motherhood, child rearing that people like Dr. Warren Farrell, who wrote The Boy Crisis, have been bringing up and have been trying to hand wave as an issue for decades. There's just no.
There's no will behind it.
Reason, or I don't know if it's not sexy and appealing on a political level, but it seems unbelievable to me that we just have so little consideration, respect, or empathy towards men. And it's not this like soft taken approach. It's men are killing themselves. Men are opting out. I have a stat in front of me when I was trying to walk through this, and it's around 7 million men have opted out in the United States. Men aged between 25 and 54 have opted out of work, and these are single men. These are men that have no aspirations of marriage or career. And the videos I watched, and by the way, half of these men, according to some data, half of these men are on painkillers or on some sort of opiate, which I found surprising. But as data is being brought in, I hear about these political pundits and these quote unquote think tank type of people try to start evaluating why this is happening, and all of them are way off. We got to create better economic incentives, and we need to cut welfare so that they have more reason to get back into the workforce. They don't have any understanding of why these things are happening, and that's not good. That only tells me that the problem's going to get worse.
Yes. It's unavoidable, this fundamental crisis of meaning, I think. We were indirectly talking about it when we talked about finding meaning in the context of going your own way, trying to find creative activities and endeavors and that sort of thing, or productive ones. The idea that you could just, I guess, throw economic stats or measures at it. It's something that Andrew Yang indirectly talks about, that sort of GDP is a poor metric. I mean, GDP doesn't really tell you much about the well-being of an individual.
No, it's a terrible metric for that type of methodology or and measurement.
So your GDP to Ben Shapiro, he's always talking about GDP. GDP's up 9.3% now. We have no problems. Don't you know that?
Yeah,
something like that.
Rising tide lifts all ships. Like, what a load of crap.
Yeah, that is just not. That's not really speaking to the problem. And
at all.
Why? You see, my sense is that these so-called elites or the policymakers don't really give a shit about any of these people. I mean, the opioid crisis is most prominent among, I guess you could say, youngish to middle-aged white men.
Yes,
but
in the West, low education attainment, and broadly speaking, Trump's base. If I want to be poignant about it.
Conversely, but conversely, we've had decades of highly destructive culture and activities in the black communities that are never talked about, save for a few individuals. I know I recently introduced you to Glenn Lowry.
Right.
that have been absolutely devastating. There's a pretense that these people are cared about, but it's simply it's just talk, really. And so,
It's a lie.
no, oh yeah, it's a lie. I think it's a lie that the policymakers really care about anything. I always bring in a concept here, and I think part of the issue is just a problem nobody really wants to talk about, and that is Dunbar's number. I think we might have talked about this before. It's a theoretically proposed
Yeah.
number. Let's say about
Right.
150 individuals. Could be a bit more, could be a bit less, where you can actually get to know and care about. When you move away from the ancestral constraints that we all evolved in of a couple of dozen individuals to these huge projects that we call civilization or even cities or states
Hmm.
and countries, everything really becomes at best a prescription of what you would do to the best of your ability and knowledge in terms of good and good deeds for the people in your tribe or the people in that small community. But the problem, really, in that case, is that these people take on the role of a functionary, which is a functionary is essentially dead without a soul. These are just sort of policies. You're looking at a bunch of numbers, maybe some stat sheets. There's
Right.
a disconnect there, an inability to really connect to the people in question, and so it's no wonder as a functionary in a society or a state where there are hundreds of millions of people that you're not going to give a shit. How possibly could you give a shit? It's the capacity is simply not there. So that's I think to really put it on, or rather put the
Hmm.
today to drive home the point that simply that's where it starts, where every policy a government enacts is based and predicated on the best intentions they might come up with in a world that never really existed for human beings. This is all really new, brand new. There's no, I mean, and so this is just a huge experiment. The modern political experiment in general, this is massively new in terms of evolutionary time.
Yes,
It
absolutely.
just sort of
And
decades in, decades out, saying we'll try this policy. I guess it's not working, and then we tend not to renovate and try to find new ones.
right. And I mean, whether it's a matter of process and the way these political institutions operate, or it's just our lack of conceptualizing the more macro issues, it does seem like the political realm is ignoring how fast society is moving forward, and they're just not able to keep up with it at all. A lot of the political discussions I have never ever take into account just how fast technology is changing our society and how you have to acknowledge that if you want to solve some of the problems, because technology has had a massive influence, both positive and negative. I'm not sure which side the needle is leaning towards, but have had a massive impact on every level of our society, on a personal level, on a communal level, an economic level, a religion. I mean, just the internet itself. Like, what more do I need to say?
Right.
And to your point about Dunbar's number, which I also learned in debate, we researched it, and I think the original experiment was called Monkey Sphere, which is
Yeah.
appropriate for this conversation. And it was a critique of politics in the sense that more localized government is preferable, because when you're dealing with policy issues that involve millions of people, there's just no honest way to assess that in a genuinely,
Concerned.
accurate manner.
Yeah.
Yeah, concerned, correct. And so I agree completely with that. To the point about how men are, to bring it full circle, and how men are opting out, and how there's this existential crisis among, in terms of the group that I'm concerned about right now, it is the white working class. I consider myself a light blue collar individual. I've lived in both, almost every level of society. In terms of right now, I have a marketing job. I'm in the corporate atmosphere, and I've been able to adapt to it. But I also spent several years when I was in my early 20s in construction, and was dealing with these people, and was seeing the ravaging effects of disenfranchisement, of what they didn't really understand it at the time, but was a existential crisis of security for the future, of demographic changes, of cultural neglect. And you're seeing these things play out more and more prominently when it comes to the way the left is addressing cultural issues, specifically how a very loud minority of the left is openly racist, and they're openly racist against white people. They've and Eric Weinstein does a great job talking about how the left has moved from class warfare to racial identity politics, and the right hasn't had a response to this other than, well, we're not racist. Like, okay, well, that's great, but and actually you're seeing it all over the place. You know, as many people who you might consider in the IDW, to put it loosely, who recognize these things are happening, there is just, whether it's cowardness, whether it's just not willing to take the risk for some reason, everyone knows this is happening. Not enough people are willing to stand up, and it has had a pernicious effect on multiple institutions. And you're seeing this in the very major and very influential areas like Silicon Valley, like the universities. It's slowly creeping into the corporate world. I haven't had to take a microaggression class yet, but I don't know if I would at my job. I'm not gonna, but I'm seeing corporatized structures and HR programs that are adopting this woke type of perspective on how society should run, and it's being done at the expense of people that I care about, that I've worked with, who have no, who have not been responsible for any of the grievances that are legitimate coming from the left. And so, I don't know if you're familiar with the research paper "Deaths of Despair." It came out in 2015.
No, not actually.
Yeah, it is. It's basically the first academic paper to discuss why this opioid crisis was happening, who it was happening to, and it was done by a Nobel Prize economist named Angus Deaton and his associate Ann Case. Excuse me. And it was done in 2015, and it showed how this epidemic of suicide, overdosing, alcoholism was having massive effects, and it had a huge uptick statistically in the last 20 to 25 years. And they one of the strongest correlating factors was economics and politics. And this is, I made this realization around 2016 when I was completely into this whole culture war. I became more reinvigorated into and getting into politics again, because I took a break after college, focused on other stuff. But it was around 2016 when actually the first time I really got reinvigorated into getting into it. It was a Ben Shapiro video, actually. Okay. Well, it was his video of his response to BLM and this, I think she was an NAACP lawyer. And he talks about how the issues of criminality, of sociological factors that are affecting Black America are not from systematic racism, but from Black culture. And he really does eviscerate these people. And it's a great video because he's dead on about it. And it sparked my interest to, who is this guy with? Well, why is he talking so fast? And it kind of led me down. It kind of led me down the rabbit hole. This, to meeting people like Molyneux. Do you know who Black Pigeon Speaks is? He's more of a
he's very good at video editing.
Yeah, yes, he is. And I started. There's some people that are more entertainment based, but are still in the current event category, kind of like Paul Joseph Watson. But then there are also people who are taking a much more serious academic approach to this society and the way that things are moving, such as Douglas Murray, who has done a great job showing the issues that are happening in Europe. But anyways, I'm completely entrenched in all of this. I'm watching your videos, their videos, and all these things. And as I'm learning all these things, I'm learning about how men are opting out. I'm learning about the opioid crisis. I learn about these deaths of despair. And I decide that, especially with my own personal experience on this, there's got to be something happening here. How do we solve it? What's the actual smoking gun? What can I point to as a starting point in fixing these problems? And this kind of goes back to that's been the underlying message of this conversation, is that because I've been stripped of many of the protective ways we deny things. I don't know if I'm explaining this correctly, but basically, because I had no longer had any hesitation in stepping into uncomfortable situations, I decided to become more politically engaged in my community. And one of the ways I did that was I got politically involved in my local government. It started around fall 2017, and I knew that the government that I'm involved in, it was very left-leaning. This particular city has had a long-standing left-leaning bias, and they fed off the racism and different other platitudes to perpetuate these things, even at the expense of the population itself. And one of the demographic populations that's been hurt the most is the white working class, and it's a very complex issue. But I thought I'd step in. October 2017 was the first time I actually went to a council meeting, and I started to get my bearings about what to expect, how things were operating. And I realized, just as many people have been saying, that there was absolutely no consideration, no insight on the issues that I was really worried about. It was, how can we find more money for instance, the very first thing I heard at this meeting was, how do we solve the gender wage gap?
What?
And I just kind of shook my, the gender wage gap was a serious priority for these people, and it was on the docket to be discussed, and they wanted to initiate the, where's that? I wrote it down. Female empowerment. Yes, go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm just surprised in a city council meeting that would be. That seems more like sort of university trivia that false trivia, obviously, but sort of propagandist trivia that you just sort of trot out to say, "Hey, let's fix," but rather than something serious to be done on a city council.
Yeah, you would think so. What I learned and why I figured out this was the case is a lot of what had been happening in this particular bureaucracy in the government had been going unchecked. That there wasn't any opposing opinion. A lot of it was, as we're seeing now from conservatives, a just subtle nod and capitulation to anything that has to do with identity politics at all. I haven't even been able to truly identify some conservatives who are on the city council because they refuse to speak up about any issues that they might not agree with. A lot of these are minority women, non-white people of color, however you want to look at it, and they were playing and banging the identity politics drum day in and day out every time I went to these, and it was for platitudes like the gender wage gap. There's equity proposals. There was racial inequality, and the solutions were more money. There was developmental issues or outcomes with minorities in education institutes, and that was systematic racism, obviously. What else could it be? I finally, after understanding, the atmosphere of this place, I finally decided to step forward with a proposal, and that happened spring of 2018. And my first discussion was educational reform and how minority development and outcomes for younger people might be addressed with things like, I lost the word, charter schools. There had been a big influence and push in my city for charter schools, and the track record for these charter schools had been highly successful, but there had been a huge amount of state funding pulled from them for reasons I'm not really sure. But I brought forward a funding proposal because this seemed like a successful path forward. And I was immediately confronted with the unions, the teachers union. There happened to be a representative there. Lucky me. And there was this huge oppositional, depiction of me as someone who didn't care about our public institutions, and there was no acknowledgement of. And this kind of goes back to the facts over feelings. I had all kinds of statistical data laid out. I had funding proposals that we had everything set up in a way that if we didn't reach certain outcomes in 2 years, we would pull the funding, which is something governments don't do anymore. And I was absolutely shut down. And this was the first of three major examples that I really want to talk about.
Yeah.
In terms of bring up an opposing opinion that has an honest and sincere, non-ideological approach to this, but it was not to be. And I was not able to get that pushed through.
This is what happened, as you remember the video I sent you about Roland Fryer, who is in ways a disciple of Glenn Loury, who was actually able to get certain funds to run a social or an educational experiment, I believe in Houston, where, from what I recall, it's been a while that since I've seen it, required the firing and the getting rid of lots of people, massive restructuring, obviously huge improvements as a result of that. But it really reveals that sort of thing. You talk about teachers unions, that it's kind of an entrenched business, and
absolutely
they don't. I mean, this is, in my experience, I was mostly a teacher at private institutions back in the day, so it's hard for me to speak of the public situation. But I would say that these people I understand they're looking out for their own hide, but they're not there to transmit knowledge or educate people. They're there to just maintain a status quo, even if the status quo is demonstrably a failure. Which
I just wanted to add real quickly that in the city I live in, our educational performance over the last several decades has been abysmal compared to the national average, and a complete and utter failure despite many different left-leaning approaches. I wouldn't even call this a political left or right thing, to be honest with you. This is just, let's find a solution. And if it happens to land on one side or the other, who cares? At least in this issue, this is educational development. This shouldn't be a divisive issue. But again, it definitely was pushing up against preconceived notions and beliefs and ways of doing things that the system itself was just not going to accept. And this was one of my first black pills, to be honest, on a political level. Like, I realized just how entrenched bureaucracy was, how systems were operating unchecked, and how monolithic my particular city's politics were becoming, at the expense of people not just that I was trying to advocate for, but for people of all races, ethnicities, and economic class levels. It just did not matter. You had to follow the narrative. You had to follow the way things were done. And if you were to step on this and try to check or change the status quo, you were going to be taken out one way or another. And that's exactly what I saw.
Yeah, there's certain issues. The problem today is, and it's always been the case to some degree, that certain issues should be, and this is just my opinion, but should be free from one particular leaning or the other. Education should be one of them. I think people are gonna. My audience is gonna, accuse me of being a communist now, but climate change is another. Even whatever, that's another one. I don't really think. I think AI and automation and the great cognitive division that's gonna just create ripples, and so things that just haven't. Yes, you can take a political, put a political twist on it, but you don't need to.
Right.
And
no need. Right.
Right. And beyond a bunch of selfish teachers who are in their entrenched unions who just want to just keep the wheel going, and understandably, I mean, people worry about their jobs, and
I
Yeah,
mean,
but
I guess that's a good enough reason. I've lost a lot of sympathy with that way of thinking. Like
well,
I
I'm
was
not
just doing.
sympathetic with it. I'm trying to
I'm
understand their
not sure if you
position.
are, but you're correct in their position that like you're risking my job and I don't want how dare you try to do these things, but yeah, not good enough. It's not legitimate enough reason to not
Well,
try
when
to.
their job has
You're
failed, right?
yes,
The
at the
current
expense of other
order,
people.
yes, the
Not
current
this
order
is
has
not the fight for
failed,
sex.
and if they can't acknowledge that, for decades now, the American scholastic system has just gotten worse and worse and worse and worse. And
Clown world.
well, yeah, I mean, the meme clown world's been going around in recent months, but it's pretty true. Um, I, it's not just me, the old guy, but I do think that in the last few decades, things have noticeably uh, worsened in my perception of Americans coming out, not universally, but in many cases, out of the system. But
Right.
and when Roland Fryer, the disciple of Glenn Lowry, attempted this experiment, there was so much opposition to it. I mean, he managed to
Yes.
get it done, but that's all it was. It was a social experiment. I don't know. I'd have to double check if it's continued in Houston. But the thing, I mean, that's something that's actually doable. Not everything has a direct solution. This is something, I forgot what the percentages were, but I know that graduation and
Yeah,
test scores went up massively.
I had them somewhere. Something like zero point 0.4 standard deviation in 2 years. But
Yeah.
to your point, had he not actually gone to a very ambitious and not ideologically driven superintendent of the school
Yes,
district, he would have
yes.
never gotten off the ground.
Yep.
The other guy bought into the idea that development and outcome was more important than narrative and status quo
Yes.
policies. So thank God for that. But yeah, his systematic change, and it really was just a systematic change in terms of how they were doing things, specifically longer school hours, different teachers. I think correct me if I'm wrong, 9 out of 10 of the principals within the school district were fired. I mean,
Yes, yeah. Some
it
high,
was a
ridiculously high number.
right. But that was the positive thing to take from that is that these are structural issues that can be
At
solved.
at least mitigated, if not outright solved.
Yeah,
Yes.
no, it's not a panacea, but it does create a substantial
help.
improvement.
And
That's
it's,
worth it.
and it's
worth it.
doable. It's feasible.
Yeah, it's
Um,
very doable.
And I mean that is the tragedy, not just on this issue. There are also ways of dealing, not solving, but dealing with the opioid crisis. There are two good instances I can think of where there was a profound drug problem in the respect Portugal and Switzerland, respectively, where there was experienced a massive reduction in drug consumption and drug abuse because of the approach they took. And both of them involve legalization. A lot of people are apprehensive about that. But also, you could say, direct forms of treatment by sort of weaning drug addicts off the addiction, allowing them to sort of consume in a safe area. Also, in Portugal, from what I recall, what they did was they said, look, this guy is a recovering drug addict, but he also used to be an auto mechanic. We're going to help you out. You only have to pay half his salary, so you save money, we'll pay the rest, and let's see how he does. And in this way, a lot of people who were out of the game got back on their feet. And if I recall as well, the head police officer in Lisbon, Portugal, the capital city, who initially was deeply skeptical of this undertaking, came out after the fact, a year or two after the fact, saying I was wrong the whole time.
Awesome.
This is not, I'm not saying this is guaranteed to work, but here's a way that the federalism of the United States and the political order of the United States could work with this. We talked about local things and state level. You could start it off as an experiment. New Hampshire has been just blasted by the opioid crisis, and I mean, it's such a small state, disproportionately.
That's right.
Place like that, you start getting, you get these drug clinics where you can figure out what the exact best way might be, but you maybe take some of the Swiss approach where you allow them to consume safely, you wean them off, and then offers incentives, maybe with the state budget if need be. It doesn't. I mean, obviously that's quote unquote communism, but whatever. And you try to get people back into the world. I mean, they still have people use drugs. It's obvious. You're always going to, but there's been a severe reduction. The violence associated with it has gone down in both of these countries. So, and you could do this in the United States on a state-by-state basis, and run that experiment. It certainly would be better than the alternative, which is currently nothing. I mean, if you want, the solution clearly is not to do nothing. You know, that doesn't seem a good solution. So,
I have a question. Was this recent change in how to deal with this in Portugal? Is this a recent event occurrence?
Not supremely recent. I'd say in the last 15 years or so. And I'll link you to some of the information later if I can dig it up. But so fairly recent. It wasn't decades and decades ago. Likewise in Switzerland, supposedly, I don't know, this is anecdotal, the reason why the public got on board with it in Switzerland is they were tired of seeing all the druggies in the parks around the fountains or what have you. So, but still, that
whatever it takes.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So you have real solutions that could, partial, however you want to term, things that would improve the situation. You could implement them.
Right.
The United States has the perfect structure because as much as state rights have been violated over the past, I say 150, 160 years now, you still have
right.
You still have a structure in the context of that allows you to do that. States could, mandate a certain discretionary budget for this project. Again, I bring up New Hampshire. It's a small state. They could see how it works there. They could try it in others. If they're successful, that would be a huge thing. It would only be part of the problem because the other reason why people use drugs is it's effectively a state of despair. I mean, you said death was despair. This is something that I don't know can be simply changed via policy. Education, academic achievement, overall drug reduction in drug consumption, sure, but how do you infuse people with a sense of meaning in, as you put it before, in an increasingly clown world? For whatever reason, and it's mostly because we had the fortune or misfortune to evolve in a certain way. If we were baboons, having as much to eat as we do now and having a roof over our heads would be plenty, but it's not. People we live in a world of plenty, and it's that's enough. And this is why you see
amazing comfort and standards of living. One would think from an outside perspective that would be more than enough to create a comfort psychologically. You're right. It has to be something else.
The issue here, and I think you see it in the online context constantly, is you have, because of this overarching lack of meaning, this lack of sense of belonging, you see all kinds of strange political ideologies emerging, some very extreme and just seem pretty retrograde, and it's like sort of just digging up ideologies from almost 100 years ago and just slapping a sticker on it and say, these sort of people LARPing as fascists and talking and playing scapegoat politics, or even people claiming that they're full-on Marxists and all this stuff, because so many people, especially young people, just lack that sense of meaning. And in some sense, it's interesting that even without the MGTOW label or the going your own way label, that what was originally or seemed originally to be an issue that was almost concretely limited to men going their own way, at least as an obvious problem of how do I create a sense of meaning, productive purpose in my own life in the absence of all the conventional dictates that I was supposed to follow but rejected. That even now, even if you're not consciously going your way, and arguably it affects females as well, the young people especially, is what do I do with my life? Sure, it's not a question, what do I do? Get a job. Sure, get a job. that's not it's not enough anymore. And this is, I think, why we see these obsessive ideologues, particularly in the online context, but all this latching onto any ideological point, because as we discussed earlier, it's better just to have a lot of people agreeing with you in unison, and you can just find yourself in an endless circle jerk talking about the same thing. It's not going to solve anything, but it sure as felt. I mean, misery loves company, right?
Yes, it provides some level of comfort, and you get the feeling that you're correct, you're accepted, you're brought into an in group.
Yes.
Very normal sociological development.
Yeah. None of that solves the problem. None of it even talks about.
No, not at all.
I'm not unsympathetic
I would say it makes it worse.
to anyone.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm not unsympathetic to any one individual or group. I listen to what they have to say, even if I don't agree with them. But I think the one thing that a lot of these guys are, a lot of these guys that obsess about certain topics that we're not going to talk about publicly here for obvious reasons. But you know what I'm talking about.
I do.
If they had some kind of direction, in their life beyond, this clown world, I don't think they would spend. Maybe they would a little bit, but not that much time on it. They'd be getting on with their lives to varying degrees. Likewise, with the people on the far left, I don't really honestly have that much to do with, but still observing them, it's all part of the same. Let's just double down so we can all feel good together. And as you pointed out, even at the local level, but certainly at the national level, politicians, they just don't give a shit, which is why I originally endorsed Andrew Yang. There's certain things that have come up where I think, that's not a great policy, like lowering the voting age. I think it's a horrible idea. That aside, it seems that Andrew Yang has tapped into the reality of our situation, that automation, AI are coming. The first fully automated Tesla car, they ran a video. I think I sent that to you, the video. Perfect,
yes.
From A to B, no problem. This is not a pipe dream. And I think if you want to talk about the new politician, it's got to be a guy who's concerned with the reality that we live in. How are we going to continue to persist in a fruitful way as people in a civilization in different countries, in this case the United States, without a meaning? And religion plays a huge role there, and if you don't have that, that's kind of an issue. That's another thing, by the way, on a side note, I notice a lot of people lamenting the passing of Christianity, but for whatever reason can't muster the belief in themselves to believe in the stuff. That's very common, I've seen. And
I continue.
Yeah, and I see that, and whatever we have to. I'm working on a video on this too, but a common reality. In order to deal with these things, we have to agree on a common reality, and we have to. For example, is it really a political issue, as you brought it, to improve scholastic performance and achievement? Is that a left issue or right issue? Well, increasingly, the left would claim it's their issue, right? Or they have done so with abysmal failure. Climate change is also a kind of a left issue, and if you believe in, I blame Al Gore, his film, and Inconvenient Truth.
I do too. I think that's really what did it. I think that's what made it
well, Mr. Novak, in the film, he predicts that Florida, actually 3 years ago now, a third of it would be underwater. This didn't come to pass. It was, so sure, that damage. There are all kinds, and I increasingly encounter people that are just so skeptical of automation. So what? They always go back almost paradigmatically on this model of the Industrial Revolution before. It's drive a tractor. I pointed this out in videos. There's a distinction moving from oxen to a tractor. If you have an automated vehicle that is a better driver than you, that doesn't tire, that doesn't require rest or food or drink or need to use the lavatory, take your pick,
and on.
It's a bit like this. I know you probably don't watch Game of Thrones, but the Army of the Dead, they don't tire, they don't stop.
I do.
Okay, right. The Night King and his army, they don't have the same limitations a human army does. They just keep on going. That's effectively
Right.
what happens with AI that works efficiently, and people don't want to talk about it. They think it's a pipe dream, and then the idea that a simple truck driver, and we could say even let's exclude, which I think is nonsense, but let's exclude that people are differentiated cognitively, and just say that he's been doing it for 30 years. What is he going to do? Is he going to? It's the whole learn to code joke. That's another issue that I think Andrew Yang, whatever his faults are, he's trying to address it earlier, rather than being caught in a monsoon and when all the houses are swept away, and everyone said, well, we kind of knew this was happening, but instead of evacuating or building a dike or a dam, we just let it happen anyway. This is
right.
insane.
And
Yeah.
to his benefit, he's at least brought forward the conversation to a broader audience. I think that's happened because of people. Well, one, the fact that he's the presidential nominee has a lot to do with it, but people like Sam Harris and Joe Rogan have brought him on their podcast to discuss these things. I think that's had a huge influence in at least discussing why UBI might be.
I'm agnostic on that issue. I don't know if UBI. We don't have good data on it. A lot of the naysayers say, "Oh, it failed in Finland." I have not looked into the Finnish example. I would need to do that.
From what I understand from the Finland example, it didn't necessarily fail as much as it had a time restraint on it, and they ended the policy because it was a experimental mechanism. So
in Alaska, it seems to work, but it's a small state. I'm not land mass wise, but population wise. But again, I'm less concerned about people, EBI, or I'm definitely called a communist for this. Even though I'm agnostic about I don't know. I'm not an economist, and it's never really been. It has not been tried before in any massive sense. But this is a guy who clearly recognizes the dangers emerging, and they're right over the horizon. And he's saying, guys, the monsoon is coming, the flood is coming.
Yes.
We can stop it. We can do something about it. We can build a dam that will divert the waters. There'll be less loss of life, and everyone's saying, it's not going to happen. So all the houses get swept away, and everyone dies. And and then the thing is, there's no joy in saying "I told you so" after the fact. I mean, I suppose some people,
not at all.
Because you're just left with a wreck, or in this case, people who are effectively hopeless. None of these issues, these pressing issues, are I think political. And a related point, I just got finished with the Sam Harris. I mean, I like Sam Harris and I dislike him. Sometimes he incenses me. His obsession with the dangers of AGI, I understand, it's fascinating, but the fact that he doesn't talk about this more immediate problem, not of AGI, so artificial general intelligence, but specific sort of task-mandated AGI, and the fact that he just these people, I call them podcast intellectuals, they just live in this bubble. Some are not all of them. Pinker's another one. He has this boundless optimism about everything. So, yes, things are better than they ever have in terms of violence, but there are still problems, and I've noticed this before. I mentioned this in a recent video. I grew up in a middle class family, but I've worked and studied, and both worked in a blue collar environment, but also in a white collar environment. I certainly studied in white collar environments, and I've seen the entire spectrum. I've seen really, really dumb people and really, really smart people, and by being dumb, I mean really dumb, and people that were just stratospherically more intelligent than I was. And I'm able to understand, as a result of it, I can make an assessment that there are these discrepancies amongst individuals that will not allow everyone to succeed in the so-called knowledge economy. And I'm just looking at Sam Harris, who claims to care. He's a kind of 90s style liberal, right? We care about the well-being of everybody. Who's obsessed with the danger of AGI. I get it. At the same time, saying we have a tsunami coming in the next 10 to 20 years, and but we'll just ignore that. And it's very frustrating.
You're right. And I mean, this is also while acknowledging differences in cognitive ability, which he has too, which should only supercharge the idea that a huge stratification and
This term,
way
this
before
emerged, the
coffee,
coastal elites, it's a real thing. And Charles
yeah,
Murray, in his discussion about 2 years ago, pointed this out. He said, Sam, how
yes,
many people do you know smoke? Now, I'm not endorsing smoking. I think it's a bad habit. But he did, and he said, well, I don't know anybody, because he just continues.
right.
And this is,
Said the last person he knew that smoked was Hitchens, and Hitchens died in 2011. So
yes. And he was kind of his own creature, right? Hitchens was his own creature.
Yes, he was.
And he doesn't. And there's no desire to connect. Not the way Charles Murray, as far as if I believe what he says, moved to a blue collar area so he could connect with the working class people that he was concerned about in Losing Ground and the other books that he's written. And
Right.
I don't see that happening in the IDW or anything. There's still. I don't know what it is. It could be a boundless optimism that everyone can get everything and do everything, or is it just fear of reputational loss?
I think that's what it is. Yeah, I think it's reputation, and I think it's a social class hesitation to deal with things that are considered outside the Overton window or third rail issues such as cognitive differences.
It's not third rail issues. There's a reason why truckers, once they're displaced, are not going to be able to, apart from the age issue. People, why don't you chop off 20 or 30 years on them? People who are emerging from that same cognitive milieu are not going to be able to find satisfying work that's going to be able to pay the bills, which is going to amplify I mean, if you think it's bad now, I looked at some statistics, and my memory is shit because I'm old and tired, but trucking is a huge industry in so many states, especially in the Midwest.
Number one occupation.
Yeah.
White male. So
Yeah.
Middle-aged white men.
So you get rid of that, I mean, deaths of despair, you're going to have, mass self-inflicted mass murders.
Yeah, I don't want to put any tinfoil on, but replacement without adequate alternatives would be undescribably destructive on so many levels. But yes, one of them would be, I think, a even greater surge of suicide, because I actually disagree with you on a point earlier. You said, that they don't understand this, and that as self-evident that it might be that someone who's been trucking for 30 years, who's 55, is just not going to be able to transition. They don't think that's true. I've listened to a lot of people try to address future job transitional movements, and one of them being automation, one of them being there's different aspects of it, but they do think that, well, we'll just retrain them. We'll retrain them. It'll be fine. We'll dump a bunch of money into it, and hopefully the gig economy, which has been
retraining doesn't work. I mean, I've looked in some. It has an abysmal failure rate.
So I don't know what. Yeah, I'm concerned, to say the least. But you brought up the point that I think really put it all together for me, and really has given me the clear perspective I need in terms of how society is moving. That is the discussion and the discussion Sam Harris had with Charles Murray, and specifically, I'm glad you brought that up, because as I was going through and trying to be more politically active and engaged, I realized that, this is for anyone out there who wants to take things seriously. That YouTube videos can only take you so far. If you really want to understand things, you have to dive into the literature. You just do. And I set upon trying to do that, except for I made the devastating blackpilling mistake of picking my first book out, which was Coming Apart by Charles Murray.
Okay.
And what I read and what I found in that is exactly, you're the only one I think I've talked to that really acknowledges this, and that's the cognitive and social and ideological divide of society over the last several decades. I would say it really started amping up in the 1950s, but it's been happening,
Well, he wrote that in 2012, if I remember right.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
I think that's right. And upon finishing that book, everything clicked. Trump's election, the everything from the failures of the union, the deaths of despair, the suicides, MGTOW, like that made perfect sense on how these things were becoming more and more prominent and serious. It all clicked, and I realized that the elites have really just disconnected themselves so completely from the average person that there really is no understanding of our perspective. And this is why a billionaire reality star New York showman is now the leader of the free world. And they just cannot comprehend that it's an act of desperation to be acknowledged on a political and social level. But people, in this case, like Sam Harris, who I think really does have Trump derangement syndrome,
Yeah,
just cannot grasp the grievances of these people. And this is also while he acknowledges that he lives in a liberal bubble. He knows that. He's taken, there's a test in Coming Apart that kind of does a rough, like, where are you and how connected are you to the rest of the world? He understands that. He's in that ivory tower liberal elite.
Well, I'll put it this way, Mr. Where else would you have a 2-hour conversation about the dangers of AGI? You're not going to have it at the local bar around the corner. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there was a time, well before my time. I guess you're pretty old. Maybe during your time. That the professionals of the community lived right next to the working class people, and that there was much more cohesion. I can't remember his name. I'm only halfway through the book, but the sociologist who wrote Bowling Alone brought this up. He's basically the left-wing version of Charles Murray. Discusses the lack of community, the lack of political capital, or excuse me, social capital, and how there's been a huge erosion of connectivity, of community, and this is exactly what's happened. And there's no response to this. There's no political response to this. And maybe there isn't. Maybe if I'm being just honest, maybe there isn't a way to do this, because if you add technology to the equation, how do you not stop the atomization of people, the disconnectedness of people from happening? Because technology seems to have a greater level of control than any other variable in this issue. And when I think I don't know if that's 100% true, but that's the best that I've been able to find. And I don't have a solution to that, no matter how radical my thinking becomes, because there's no.
I think you hit the nail on the head that this has been my own thesis for a long time, that the atomization that many people complain about, it's not. It's simply a byproduct. Right? It's simply a byproduct of a massively technological world where everyone's connected but disconnected in a way that had been inconceivable even decades ago. And you don't turn back from that. I mean, not unless you destroy everything. Okay, a few people advocate that, but we're gonna be moving ever more forward in that direction. And look, I agree with you that there may or may not be a solution, but if there isn't a solution, let's first talk about it, and have smart people talk about it who understand the problem. And if they can't come up with a solution, well, so be it. But at this point in time, there's no acknowledgement of it. I mean, and maybe it's because, well, I think it's largely because the elites they don't care. And B, they don't have a solution. What's the solution? Just to throw more money at things? It's a real quagmire. It's a conundrum.
Yes, it is. And I have a real pessimistic look at this. I think that the stratification of society and class has created a real level of elitism on the very top. And I think there's this feeling of dismissal or disgust even of the lower classes of society. And I think that's one of the reasons why, a lot of the grievances from the right-wing populists in America are just not being addressed or taken seriously. And to get to the point, I don't think they care. I think some do, some are concerned, but I think that the smart people who are recognizing this are also on the winning side of these effects. And I think that's having a very, very strong pervasive effect on how they move forward with this issue. And that's nothing. There's nothing new about that in world history. It's like it's a technological equivalent of the Pareto distribution.
Yeah.
A few people are moving the world forward, and it will be at the expense, less and less so, less now than ever, but it will be at the expense of less relevant people, and that's a tough pill to swallow too. If you don't have the power, the money, or the persuasion, you have no say. And democracy be a check back against this, but democracy's been co-opted and corrupted so badly that our political institutions are nothing but political theater and a popularity show that everyone acknowledges is a joke, but still buy into because we don't think, or maybe they're right, we don't have any other way of expressing our issues and our concerns on a societal level, and I think that's true.
And on a final note, I mean, I know the other day we talked about this. There's a level of impotence that I acknowledge exists as an individual. You're just talking about inability to get through to people and all of this. And I told you, shitty advice, that the only thing I can do, the only thing I can think about is, it's hard to stay committed to a view of the world. A
losing battle.
Well, not just a losing battle, but when the most valuable thing I can offer for myself and others is that you need to be able to live with yourself, right? And different people have different standards for that. Now, for myself, that includes being true to a certain vision of trying to understand the world, not falling for extremes because they seem appealing. Indeed, most of them don't seem appealing to me, but still. Because there's no reward for that. There's no circle jerk, and it's not, that view is not going to be reified by anyone else. You can only feel that or reify it for yourself. And I think that it's a difficult path to walk, but my argument,
it's a lonely path.
It's a lonely path. It's very lonely, but I mean, it's cheesy to say, but if you don't walk it, very few other people will. And here's the thing: if no one else is out to understand the world and try to present informed, balanced arguments, then the likelihood of any solution to anything goes from very slim to non-existent, because people that have been persuaded by any extreme view, left, right, pink, purple, polka dot, whatever, they might take their little factoids here and there, but they're not going to be looking at the big picture, and they're not going to be able to look at the ways of solving. They're not going to be able to look past their own politics. So, as you are, as an individual who may or may not want to remain active in politics, locally or otherwise, I would simply say that you have to be able to live with yourself, and even if the entirety of the rest of the world doesn't acknowledge what you're doing and your own methods, you got to do it yourself. I certainly do. I wouldn't have brought you on to talk to you if I didn't think highly of you, and you know that. And I think that we need more people like you, because nobody else does it. I mean, again, let's say there's a 1% chance of solving something.
Right.
0% is always worse than 1, right?
I've always known that, and I tried to push forward politically 3 things. It was education reform, it was welfare reform, and it was creating advocacy for all males. And that was my MGTOW moment that also got shut down because of the wokeness. But I knew going into this, especially after having a more thorough understanding of the environment, that the likelihood of success was demonstrably low.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right that we can't let lunacy go unchecked. And the fact is, and this is something I should have brought up earlier, is even after these meetings occurred and there was massive resistance and inevitably a rejection of my proposals, I had people come up to me after the meeting saying, you're exactly right about these things. I've been thinking about this all along. You're correct. We've never heard this perspective. And, there's optimism in that. I get frustrated when they say it behind closed doors, though. We need people to take the risk and stand up to pathology, to dogma. And one thing, if I can give some optimism here, one thing I do realize, and I think more people are open to, despite all the psychological resistance to change that people have, if you can prove to people that what you're saying is a effective solution that's not grounded in a political perspective or an ideological perspective, but just from a pragmatic stance, people are way more open to it because they don't see you as a opposition as much as an alternative.
Yeah.
What I mean by that, if you're looking at, one of the things I think was very successful was when I was discussing about educational reform is they asked me what my politics were in a very subtle way, but I didn't fall into that argumentative trap because I knew that was immediately going to create a characterization of what I'm trying to do, and it was going to psychologically create alternative motives that I didn't have. And so you have to keep that away and keep people open to the idea that, look, do you want to be right or do you want to find the truth? Do you want to win or do you want to solve the problem? This is the difference between debate and discussion, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I think when people realize that, especially people with kids, and those who have a investment in the future, it becomes pretty compelling. But it's a hard shell to crack, as I'm sure you're aware.
Oh, yeah. I mean, but I remain resolute in trying to stick to the balanced view, and the world is complex, and you're only going to find solutions embracing that complexity. Certain visions are just too limited and myopic. So, and I agree. This has been my experience too. That when having sort of, I guess you could say, moderated discussions and debates and observed, and I noticed then you were actually present for one when the right side was attacking that one gentleman. He was very very emotional, and I'm not going to I'm not trying to tout my own horn here, but when I was trying to be a bit more neutral about it, he seemed much more amenable to certain points, right? And
right.
Essentially, approaching something somewhat apolitically seems to be one of the most effective tools in broaching certain topics and really just
absolutely
getting somewhere. And whereas when you announce to the world that look at me, I'm on the right, I'm far right, or here I'm a Marxist, it just everything gets shut down at the beginning. The conversation hasn't even started and it's already shut down.
Right. I think breaking down the preconceived notions coming into a conversation is an absolute necessity if you really want to find some common ground. And I wouldn't even say compromise. Like Eric Weinstein's brought this up. I'm sure you've experienced it, and I see it all the time. And again, I fall back to my debate experience. When I'm having a political discussion or any sort of discussion that involves society or things like that, I'm quickly able to assess whether or not they're trying to win an argument or they're genuinely interested in how do we solve this problem. It becomes pretty apparent pretty quickly. And a lot of it is how defensive are they, how pointed or aggressive are these questions. If we really want to solve these problems, and I don't want to be apocalyptic, but some of these problems involve millions of people and their humanity, their ability to live a good life. So these are serious issues, and a lot of people, I assume, that'll listen to this, if they're not entrenched in it right now, they definitely know people who are struggling in a similar fashion. And so it seems to me that coming into the conversation trying to find a solution is much more important than trying to win your position. And it all starts by coming into the conversation in good faith. It starts with good faith. And you have to we have a bad actor problem. We have a divisive tribal issue right now that
an ego issue. People, that's the debate angle. You want to win points, and you want to cut the other person down rather than try to solve things.
Right, and it was fun. At my debate experience, it's hard. It's easy for me to fall into that and really start laying into people, but I've also realized like I don't get a trophy afterward. How
Yeah.
about I just try to explain and inform people? Um, there's other stuff that I'd like to talk about, but I think just showing some humility, showing some decency, and seeking the truth are what I really want to is the message I really want to send out to people listening, because we have plenty of issues that need solving, and you're more capable than you think. I engaged in a very active way, and I reached out, and I was successful in the sense that people realized that what was happening was not working. I didn't achieve my goals, but I realized that, as you said earlier, things can't go unchecked, and you're probably going to be more effective than you think if you actually do some hands-on. Um, Activism may not be the word, but
Activity.
if you actually, yes, get engaged. You'll be surprised how effective you can be despite the odds. So,
And on that optimistic note, somewhat optimistic, I think you've you've moved from a black pill to a swarthy gray pill. So maybe you'll transition
look at me
to
go.
a full gray pill, and who knows what new hue your next pill will take on. But yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm hopeful that in the future, Mr. Novak might, at some point in time, have his own YouTube channel. It's not clear if that'll be the case, but if he does, I will certainly let you know about it. And I think he would make very good content. He's an open-minded guy, and I think he's trying to do the right thing. And I think most importantly, he's an upright guy, and I think that's a very rare quality these days. So, anything else you'd like to add?
I think that's enough for now. Stardust.
Okay.
I appreciate the conversation.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. Everyone, thanks for tuning in, and as always, if I'm still alive, we'll check you out at a later date. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.